So let's start with something about the plague. Anything different at the moment in your life besides some of the obvious things, but what are you doing differently since the shelter in place? How has it affected your life?
Well, I'm getting a lot more work done, but I think I always tend to get a lot more work done. I stopped listening to the news because it's a bunch of bourgeois, and you're going to find out what happens the next morning when you wake up anyway. But I know the plague is abating because now they're talking about killer Japanese hornets, right? So since the news is in charge of, it's like cigarettes, right? Or it's like cocaine, they're in charge of making you angry and terrified. If they're running out of raising the panic level about the plague, we know that the plague must be abating because now they want to scare us to death with hornets.
I hadn't heard about the hornets yet, but I will.
Oh, the hornets are great. No, the hornets are on the West Coast. You'll get them.
Okay.
Don't worry.
I'm wondering if anything has surprised you about the cultural reactions in the United States to the plague, and do you see anything lasting from this? Anything shifting, given?
Yeah, I do.
The anxiety.
I want to tell you guys about a book I discovered. I hope you will all read it. It was written in 1950, and it was called Europe and the Jews, originally titled as The Foot of Pride by a Scots Catholic guy called Malcolm Hay, Hay, who was a Scots lord. He got shot up very badly in the First World War fighting for Britain, and then he became a historian, and he went to pre-statehood Israel, then Palestine, after the Second World War to look around, and was horrified at what the British were doing to the Jews. Horrified when he learned what the Turks had been doing to the Jews, what the Syrians had been doing to the Jews, and what the world had been doing to the Jews. And in fact, dividing the world up into the places they couldn't stay and the places they couldn't go. So he shut himself up in a room and learned Hebrew. And then there was a British order issued that all British non-military subjects had to leave the country. So he went underground, and he lived as Rabbi Hay for 3 years underground around the time of the founding of the state, while he wrote this magnificent scholarly history of anti-Semitism, back from the earliest Roman days up to the British blockade and Cyprus, and the ongoing British anti-Semitism. And one of the greatest sections is about the Dreyfus affair. And he catalogs the Dreyfus affair very, very, very carefully as a media event. He says that a lot of it was blown up, not that they weren't anti-Semitic swine, which they were, especially in the army, which was the old line Catholics. They hated the Jews. But that there was this fellow called Drummond who was a publisher, and he founded this paper called La Libre Parole to flog Jew hatred, and it made him a huge millionaire. He was very, very, so everybody got up every morning and read the Libre Parole and the other offshoots to find out about how bad the Jews were, right? And so what this guy was doing was recapitulating all of the terrible lies that have been told about the Jews for 2,000 years, that they poisoned wells, that they were both communists, wanted to rule the world through Bolshevism, and capitalists wanted to rule the world through capitalism, that they delighted in the death of Christian children, and so on and so forth, that they had no country, and they were traitors everywhere they went. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, well, golly gumdrops, this sounds awfully familiar, because this is exactly what we see with anti-Trumpism, that the left, basically the leftist media, has created this protean monster who can do all things and will do all things, who is evil. Whatever he does is evil. All of his policies are evil, that he's capable of following two completely antithetical policies at the same time in order to ruin the world by ruining the economy, and in order to ruin the world by making a lot of money for himself. And we get up every morning and we listen to this rant, which it can't all be true, and who knows if any of it is true, but if you follow the money, it's making a lot of people a lot of money. So that helped me to understand a little bit about anti-Semitism. Because you look back at Europe, which has always been and is now, of course, going through a paroxysm of anti-Semitism, it's hard to, or perhaps impossible to resist propaganda that takes up one's whole day, B is the only topic of conversation between you and your friends, and C, if you don't subscribe to it, will get you in a shitload of trouble.
Do you think there's been any more possible solidarity? The way, people talked about after 9/11, there was actually great solidarity for a while. Maybe it was temporary, but that, everybody's saying it's like a science fiction movie, and it struck me how much people are going to narrative and to films and books that is the only way to understand what happened, that it was so unprecedented. So that's why, as a dramatist, I just thought to ask you if, on the other hand, they say Shakespeare had 2 plagues in his lifetime, and even though he references the plague, nobody in his plays ever dies of the plague. Like, he didn't let it affect his work. So maybe, maybe things don't change as much.
Well, I mean, you can go read Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. You could also read my play November, which was on Broadway 12 years ago, was about a president who's running for office and everything gets screwed up because the country gets taken over by bird flu, Chinese bird flu. So it's a whole bunch of Chinese bird flu jokes. So these plagues have always been with us. The problem is, if any organization gets so big that human beings can't keep track of it, we end up with chaos. And there's a pretty good book on this subject. It's called The Torah, and it comes right at the beginning, and it's called the Tower of Babel, that we know so many things that we can build a tower to heaven, right? We can be like God, we'll build a tower to Babel. Babel, Hevel, of course, is vanity, right? And the other thing that I was thinking this morning is they wanted to build a tower to heaven. Okay, what was the other thing that they all wanted to do? They all wanted to speak the same language, right? The Babylonians discovered we're all going to speak the same language. If we all speak the same language, we're all going to find out we all want the same things and everything will be fine. The only problem with that is, as we see in the now failed European Union, who gets to decide what the language is, right? So somebody is going to be in charge of deciding what the language is, which is speech control and eventually thought control when it gets out of hand.
Well, so going back to how stories, prepare us for these kinds of major changes, it actually made me think of the phenomenon of the fact that there are always people who told us what was happening. There were always, when we look back, people that knew exactly what was coming. And I think of this because you cite people like this. You mentioned philosopher Eric Hoffer, who wrote in 1960 that the West had 40 years to get off oil, or our next war wouldn't be with the Soviet Union, it would be with certain Arab oil producing, like people who knew, like Cassandra, and your play November, where you had this bird flu outbreak affecting the president. And you also famously had a joke in there about the president wanting to build a wall with Mexico, and the joke about that, well, they can't keep out the immigrants because they would need them to build the wall. So you predicted that too. I mean, what do you think about this? We have so many false prophets who are adding to the babble of it and adding to the noise, but we also seem to have people that tell us exactly what we should be doing, and we just don't separate those. Or how can we listen better?
Well, we can't listen better. We're human beings, which means we're stupid fools, you and me and everybody else, which is what the Torah is about. It's to say you cannot trust, you should not go astray after the zonim achareim, after the musings of your heart, which in the Bible language says, which you are whoring after, right? That's a prayer you're supposed to say every day. That the heart in the Bible meaning the mind. You can't trust yourself, right? So the question is, what can you trust? And it might be good to have a guide to self-restraint, whether that's called the Chumash or whether it's called the Constitution. Because once we say, I don't need that, everything's perfectly clear, we're going to be taken over by a dictator.
Well, so in the Bible, there are several prominent examples of the Jews not learning lessons from our mistakes and from punishments. Are there good examples where we do, where we avoid these fates because we say, oh, no, wait, this happened to us before, or we learned this time, we didn't listen last time and these bad things happened, I mean, because you could argue that.
No, of course not. I mean, as Rabbi Kushner said, there's nobody in the Torah you want your kids to be like, right? The record of the Chumash, and then when you get into the prophets, is you're whoring after your own heart. You're human beings, knock it off, right? The only good example, which some people say is a joke, is the example of Jonah. Because he says, I don't want to go to Nineveh, I don't want to go to Nineveh. It's, you know what it is? It's the Ralph Cramden, Jackie Gleason version of Moses. He says, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. He gets swallowed by a fish. They put him on land. He has to walk around the city saying, God will destroy your city in 30 days. Nineveh will be destroyed. And they all go, oh my God, Nineveh will be destroyed. No, we're going to embrace God. We're going to go straight, right? And so some rabbis say that that's included as a joke. It's a gag, right? Because that's actually not the way things happen. But everything else in the Torah is a record of our waywardness. Because we can't remember that day to day, because we think we're all real smart. We aren't very smart, very cunning, but we aren't very smart. And we certainly aren't very wise.
So talk about the experience of writing the book with Rabbi Kushner. I really wonder about, because you mentioned so much in the last few years, the Bible as this central cornerstone of, you know, our society, but also of your writing and of human nature. What was it like to sit down with such a smart, learned rabbi and sort of try to write something about each parsha?
Well, it was great. You know, I met Larry Kushner before I got married. My wife and I just came back from, hadn't been married, just came back from a trip to Israel. And we moved to, for some reason, to Boston. And somebody said, you have to see this great rabbi. And he said, okay. And she was, her people were Jewish a couple of generations back, but they were kind of nothingy, not atheistic or agnostic English people. So Larry Kushner says, well, you guys have to have a Jewish wedding. So Rebecca, you have to have a conversion. So Rebecca says, no, wait a second. I've been taking these Introduction to Judaism class. By the way, anybody who gets a chance to go to these Introduction to Judaism classes, whether you're schlepped by a significant other or go by yourself, let me highly recommend it, because I went at age 38, 40, I realized I didn't know a damn thing. So she says, well, rabbis are supposed to push with one hand and pull with the other hand anybody who wants to be a Baal Teshuvah. And Larry Kushner says, no, I don't think so. We're going to marry you as a Jew. We're going to have a bet din. You're going to go to the mikveh. So he started going to his shul, and he says, well, you know, I see you guys like the Torah. Wouldn't you like to learn how to read it? So he said, well, golly gumdrops, you know, we aren't that smart and we don't have that much time. He said, it's simple. And so he started having classes, and Lauren, his Shams had the classes, and we learned how to read the Torah, and it really changed our life. So then we became very close, and we started writing the book.
I guess I have always felt, is it possible that one of the reasons so many dramatists, so many Jews are drawn to write, and is that, you know, what Christians call the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, are so full of imperfect characters, perfidy, deceit, betrayal, disloyalty, you know, unlike the New Testament, where, you know, it really pushes forward toward this vision of being washed clean of our sins by the blood of the Lamb, and, you know, turning the other cheek. And, you know, we don't obviously uphold the behavior of some of our great, but we understand it. We wrestle with it. We say it's very understandable why our characters wanted the firstborn blessing, and, you know, even though they did something terrible for that. Do you feel that the Bible, in a way, primes us for a more realistic understanding of human nature, and that there's a connection of that to great drama?
Well, we have a very hermetic society. You know, my grandparents came from Russian Poland. They've been in Poland for 600-700 years, and before that, probably in Spain and Italy and in Turkey and every place else they got kicked out of. So the gene pool was very, very small, and we were forced to stay together because nobody wanted us there. We were unwelcome guests wherever we were when they weren't turning us into bath soap, and we didn't have a country. So what we had to keep us together, curiously, which has kept us together furious at each other for the last 2,000 years, is a book. And the book is all these stories which are incredibly provocative. And if you read them every year, they have a brand new meaning every year. You see brand new meanings in them because nothing is this positive. We don't have a hierarchical religion, right? And so one of the ways this has saved us as Jews is a hierarchical religion will eventually elaborate form, right? So you start off with this one Jew, Jesus. He says, be nice to each other. They say, oh, good, that's a good idea. Love it, I'm gonna do it. 2,000 years later, you got the Vatican and this order and that order and blah, 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 and a hierarchy of priests and all sorts of orders and religious ceremonies, which is great, there's nothing wrong in that. But to do that, you have to have a home. We didn't have a home, and we didn't have a hierarchy. And so what we had was a book, which enabled us all to argue about the book, which is what Rabbi Kushner said to me and Rebecca. He said, you really want to argue about the book, read the language, right? Then you have as much right to interpret the language as Moses did, or as Aaron did, or as Joshua did, equal right, right? So that's what we have takes us together, is the ability to look at stories and say, what do they mean? So that's why the Jews, at least for thousands of years, have been the storytellers and the writers.
And you've written or spoken about human nature as having, and your plays, the subject of your plays is how people can behave like swine under stress, and you don't romanticize our impulses. And I just kind of wanted to talk about squaring that with your Judaism, and squaring that with how Judaism instructs us to investigate how we should live, and the values of the community, and trying to make the spiritual and ethical insights of the Torah the foundation of our lives. I guess, you know, I'm sort of curious how living a Jewish life and then embracing, you once said, being Jewish does not make one liberal or conservative, it just makes one argumentative. Is that a saving grace? Is that in the end actually the best thing about it, that we, you know, aren't told exactly what to do, but we have to figure it out?
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
As we were talking about the other day, Daniel, you and I, right, that the old Talmudic injunction to sit down and state the other person's position such that he agrees that's correct, he states yours, then we can adduce facts, and then we can go forward. That is the essence of the search for justice. Now, as it says, right, any place there's law, there's injustice. Okay, so there's never going to be perfect justice, but there are rules if the community is cohesive enough, whereby the people can say, yes, in this case I lost, in this case I was ruled against, but I see that the process was fair according to a pre-existing form to which I ascribe. So that's a big deal.
Sorry, I wanted to, now, I guess with the possible exception of Steven Spielberg, I couldn't think this morning of a major writer or director who has made his Judaism, you know, in the last 20 years, say, so clear in his public persona as you, and has brought it up in your teaching examples. You know, I watched your master class, and it's so natural how it comes out when you want to illustrate a point, that it's like something from the Bible or something from Jewish learning. And, you know, and then I thought of your dramas, not the books on Judaism, but the dramas. I thought of Homicide and of Lansky. And then I had to think that other than a Jewish character, if you've ever been able to take one on as a protagonist, or if there's maybe something unproduced that we don't know, or is there maybe something you weren't able to get funded, like, or, you know, am I wrong? What am I missing in terms of putting Jews as your main characters?
Well, I also wrote what I think is a pretty good novel about the Leo Frank case, which was called the American Dreyfus case in Atlanta, Georgia in 1915. And Homicide, of course, is the main character, is Joy Montaigne, is a Jewish cop. But part of the situation out here is that Hollywood was founded by Jews and run by Jews. I think it's probably still run by Jews, who are all passing for white, right? Because we aren't in the business, as a business of being Jews, but of getting the asses in the seats. And so we intuited, perhaps correctly, that middle America didn't want to see stories about Jews, and that wasn't our job as Hollywood movie makers to make stories about Jews, but to make stories about Americans. In so doing, we created this fictionalized vision of Father Knows Best America, which never shone on land or sea. And then we started to believe in it.
Yeah, yeah. You wrote something called Russian Poland about where your grandparents are from, right? Was that something you could,
Yeah. That's a movie I wrote. It was based on the stories of Isaac Luria, R.E., and it's I'd love to make this movie. It's about these guys. I knew a bunch of guys who were, who founded the Israeli Air Force with the first flyers. And one of the things that they did was, there was an arms embargo, of course, against the Jews in Palestine prior to the war. There was not against the Arabs. The Brits were funding the Arabs. Everyone was funding the Arabs. The Brits were fighting for the Arabs, but the Jews could not buy arms. And so one of the things that Jews did was funded by I think largely by, by the, whatever the mix was of the Irgun and the Haganah at that point, is they bought airplanes, ex-World War II flyers, mainly Jews in the United States, bought airplanes to fly to Israel. But since there was an arms embargo, the FBI, remember the FBI, didn't want the Jews to have arms because that was the law. And so the Jews had to create these phony airlines. They say, well, I'm flying fruit from Cuba, or I'm flying bananas, blah, blah, blah. And then the FBI would impound the plane. So I wrote this movie about these two guys, these two Jewish flyers, have to steal back a B-17 and fly it to Israel. And they take up an old DP, an old displaced person on the runway, who's turns out to be a Hasid, and to pass the time, he starts telling stories of the old country, and we keep flashing back into the stories which are Isaac Luria of Sfat. It's his mystical tales.
Wow, I love the combination of the mystical tales and the beginning of the IDF Air Force. I hope you get to make it. Have you seen?
Hope so too.
Have you seen Above and Beyond? It's a documentary by Nancy Spielberg about the beginning of the Israeli Air Force.
No, I didn't see. I'm looking forward to it, but
you must.
Another thing here's something you'll enjoy. I wrote a book that just come out called 3 War Stories. There's 3 novellas. And one of the novellas is again about 2 ex-GIs in Las Vegas. One of them's a homicide cop, he's Jewish. The other's a murderer, he's Jewish, and about how they're trying to get to Israel.
Got it. So right around the time that you, I think, got engaged to Rebecca and were kind of going through her conversion and your own deeper learning, you wrote Homicide. And in that, the detective is a sort of very assimilated Jew who is investigating the murder of an elderly woman, a Holocaust survivor, in her store over some money they think she has. And he comes into contact with the Jewish community, who are strong Jews who are not going to let anyone determine their fate. And he's very compelled by them and wants to, for the first time, he's awakened and wants to be among them. But they exploit that, right? That it leaves him open. This sense of belonging that he never had leaves him open to being able to be played for a sucker. And I found that interesting in the sense that it's a work, unless I'm misinterpreting it, about somebody who experiences this awakening of belonging, and also then like his detective instincts are diminished, right? And they end up exploiting him a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, well, we Jews are very, very good at bad news, right? We're very, very bad at good news. Good news makes us incredibly antsy because we know it's going to be followed by bad news. So that the stories in the Torah are all stories of bad news from which we can gain insight. Where the New Testament is a gloss. It's kind of the after school, aside from our good pal John, that the Synoptic Gospels are kind of the after school version of the Torah, right? We want to take it and reduce it to how to. And if you do this, everything's going to be cool. But the Torah is very, very different because what are the lessons in good news, right? And then they all woke up. There aren't any lessons in it.
Yeah, yeah. And in that, the news is that you can be played by your own people as well as you know, obvious antagonists. Well, so let's talk about writing Jewish characters today. With I don't know if I mean the premise of the question is that there's an uptick in anti-Semitism out there. There's been some incidents in the last 10 years that an increase in certain types of incidents. A lot of conspiracy theories online, even about the coronavirus being spread by Mossad agents, and most of it is, we can agree, is absurd. But I wonder if writing a Jewish character, if you ever think about that in a different way, or if you think writers should, like these days. And
tell me again, what's your question?
Could you write Shylock today, or would it be irresponsible? Like given that or do you not worry about the stupid people out there and you can write Jews just as flawed and as as fallible as anybody else? Or do you?
It doesn't make any difference. It makes absolutely no difference at all. That the anti-Semitism keeps breaking out and keeps breaking out, and the only major change in our prognostications of anti-Semitism is the state of Israel.
Yeah, yeah.
The United States is, as far as I know, the only country in the world where all of the Jewish institutions do not have armed guards outside. And any Jewish institutions in the United States which don't have armed guards outside are nuts. We have armed guards outside of shoe stores on Rodeo Drive, but the Jews in the diaspora have got a bad case of "don't hit me." And it's completely understandable, because they've been throwing us into the ovens for 2,000 years, and the only way we survived, Baruch Hashem, was by keeping our head down, trying to be useful to the society, and hoping not to get killed.
Yeah.
So that there's an inherited, as Conrad Lawrence said or didn't say, that that acquired characteristics are not genetically transmissible. I think they are. I mean, I think that they are. I think you can't have a closed group for 2,000 years saying, "Don't hit me," and leave me alone until you decide to kill me. It's going to have some effect. And so as we see that the resistance to the state of Israel among the American Jewish community, among the Western Jewish community, especially among the German Jews and the Brits, was huge. People said, going back to Pinsker and auto-emancipation, and going through Theodore Herzl and on, they said, "You're out of your mind. What are you, crazy? Keep your head down. I want to keep those damned Ostjuden away from me, because I'm the good Jew. I'm doing good, right? I got a dry cleaning establishment, or I own a railroad or something. Don't hit me. I'm the good Jew." And so we see this today, and have seen it in the New York Times, for example, which is basically an anti-Semitic newspaper run by Jews, saying, "Oh, the bad Jews, those bad state of Israel, boo-hoo."
So I want to actually ask you about some of the Israeli shows and find out if you've been watching them, but just to
no, I haven't, because I just watch old movies every day. Okay. I don't watch television.
There are a couple good ones that are TV and film in some ways are, TV is taking some of the good things about movies, and there are a couple that might be worth checking out. But just back to this thing about the "don't hit me" Judaism, I read, you talked about how in your youth, what Jewishness was number one, education, number two, success, and number three, assimilation. I think, I'm paraphrasing, that in your house and in your culture, but among ourselves, and this is a quote, "We shared the wonderful, the warm, and the comforting codes, language, jokes, and attitudes, pride in our accomplishments, and Jewish food and jokes, neither of which were probably very good for us. But there was a shame too about it beneath the surface." So you're saying, so in a way, that's the blueprint of what you're sort of describing later too, whether it's in Hollywood or some of the media about this sort of slight sense of shame, even though there's a tremendous pride in achievement and culture. Is that right?
Well, Jews are anxious, right?
Yeah.
We're very, very anxious people because we've been living on the edge for a very, very long time. So the question is, who am I? So I think, I hope, learned a bunch from the time in which I grew up, both in the gay pride movement and the black pride movement, where all of a sudden elements of the community came out of the closet and said, it ain't my problem, it's your problem.
Yeah.
Right? And so as our brothers and sisters in Israel said, A, it's your problem, and B, if you want my arms, come and take them.
Yeah. And I'm also just connecting to your language, and you're taking on writing at a young age. Another quote that I read of yours where you said, in my family, in the days prior to television, we liked to while away the evenings by making ourselves miserable, solely based on our ability to speak the language viciously. And how language, in a way, for some of your characters, and is like an armor, and is an ability, is kind of you know, something that if you can wield it more convincingly than the other guy, you can kind of control the argument or control the narrative a little bit better. Is that fair?
Well, that's actually what speech is for. You know, it's been said speech was invented to hide intention, but people use speech in life not to express themselves, although it seems like we do, but to gain something. So that was when I figured that out, I said, okay, I can write that. I get it. That the characters in a play are exactly the same as the people at the laundromat. They're speaking to achieve an end, and they only say those things which might help them achieve that end. So if you apply that backwards to writing drama, anything which doesn't help the character to achieve his end, take it out.
Right, right.
Do that, and oh, how about that? The play starts to whip along.
Tell us a little bit about your new book, the Diary of a Porn Star by Priscilla Riston Ranger, as told to David Mamet with an afterword by Mr. Mamet.
Well, let me see if I can find a copy.
Okay.
Thank you for asking. This is my favorite book.
I must say, I'm naive enough that I Googled Priscilla Riston Ranger, and then before I realized it was a novel because it's so cleverly titled. And it's a great.
You guys see that?
A great cover. Yes, yes.
Diary, oh, spectacular. That's a photo of a very, very famous photo of Betty Page, who was a very early crossover porn star. So I was looking at.
Well, wasn't it called erotica back then? I mean, it wasn't, you know, we didn't quite have explicit porn.
Well, yeah, you know, I think it was it became erotica. Before that, it was called nature studies, right? So I was looking at this whole Stormy Daniels thing, and I thought it was really funny. I thought it was so funny. So I thought, I'll make up her life. I don't know anything about Stormy Daniels except her name. I said, I'll make up the life that she leads, and I'll write her autobiography. And then I'll get in touch with her and ask her, you know, she want to go halvesies, and we'll say she wrote it and sell 1 trillion copies, which it would have at that time. But we had to go through Michael Avenatti, and I guess he was busy, you know, going to jail or something like that. So I thought, well, okay. So I wrote it. And so this will give you an idea about the book. She says, how many women can say they've been trout fishing with Shimon Peres? So she learns trout fishing. She works for the Forest Service. She lectures on fruitwood at the Naval War College. She goes to Antarctica with this guy. I had such a good time writing it. Here's some of the quotes.
You gave her an incredible life, such that the porn star part is almost an afterthought. It's almost the least interesting thing about her. I read an excerpt online. She has such.
Well, that's what she says. She
Yeah.
says that is the least interesting thing about it. She says there's only so many ways you can, quote, do it. Here's a quote. Like Riesman, Arrebourg, and Colette's Le Pur et l'Impur, and not unlike the poems of Verlaine and Rimbaud, Miss Riston Ranger reveals to us the inner cohesiveness of previously unsuspected aspects of our common world. Le métro, la semaine littéraire. Isn't that a beautiful quote?
Yes, and I want to read it now. But I can't ask you more since I haven't read it yet. But I want to ask you about 2 of your films that are a little bit different stream than maybe say the bulk of your work. I watched Red Belt last night. And actually, first of all, is martial arts still a part of your life? That's about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. right?
Yeah. Well, I think I started getting a little bit older, and they say that jujitsu is the old man sport, but I think I aged out, so I took up some other hobbies. But I'm very close with all the people in the community still. So that's my answer to that.
It's a very, in some ways, it's a beautiful film because it's about a noble character who refuses to bend principles and pays a heavy price. And I was trying to think of it in, you know, whether it's biblical terms or in the terms of your other work. It actually reminded me most of The Winslow Boy, you know, which is also about someone who has committed no wrong. You know, a lot of your characters are, let's say, engaged in morally compromising behavior when we meet them. And these are two guys who are not, you know, they're running, well, the Winslow Boy's a kid, but Mike Terry in Red Belt is, you know, trying to run his dojo in an extremely honorable way and bring discipline to people's lives, and the corrupt world comes calling. And I don't know, I guess I'm curious of those different starting points. You know, when you start a drama, sometimes do you have an idea of a character, you know, whose motives are clean, but who's going to be visited on the unclean world versus a character who is engaged in something unclean? I don't know, I guess I really liked it. And I wanted to ask you if that type of film is, you know, still close to your heart.
Oh, I love that movie. Also in that movie, there's a whole lot of really great martial art, really world-class genius martial artists who I got to work with, playing themselves and playing others. And it's a fight film, so it's a great genre. There's the fight film.
I guess my question is about the discipline. Because he has a code, right? Because he has a set of principles, he lives differently than the rest of the world. And that seems like something that is one of your concerns in your work. And whether it's the Bible or the Constitution, as you talk about, is martial arts in a way in that.
Well, you know what it is? It's that movie.
Uh-huh.
You know, to put it differently, a lot of people ask me, where do you get your ideas? And I tell them that there's this little Mexican guy who sells them off the back of his truck in Encino on Sunday mornings. Or to be clear, I have no fucking idea where I get my ideas. Neither do you, where you get your ideas, right? That's the difference between ideas and the shopping list.
Yeah. Okay, so, all right, well, you said you haven't watched a lot of TV lately, but I wonder if you've thought of making any more, because The Unit was really good. For those of you who are listening who may not remember, David created a show. You wrote a few scripts for Hill Street Blues and then created The Unit, which is about a kind of a special ops military unit like the Delta Force, and who have this intense cohesion and do these different missions each episode. I think it holds up really well. It's on Hulu, and I've been enjoying these episodes during the lockdown here. Was that just kind of a one and done for you? You know, or have other people approached you and offered any kind of creative freedom to create something else?
You know, it's time for me to sit out on the bench. You know, Leo Tolstoy, remember Leo Tolstoy? Right? Complete commie, stone commie. So at the end of his life, after being the world's greatest novelist, and vastly wealthy and inherited titles, decided that he wanted to basically run away to some monastery. And so he wrapped himself up and he trudged off through the snow at Yasne Polanya. And they had to bring him back and put his feet in a warm bath and give him a hot toddy and say, okay, it's okay, pal. You did your work, sit down, you can die now. Right? Just like Moses. So I'm in the same position, except I'm sitting out on a beach chair by the pool with a Negroni. And and I'm looking forward to that nunc dimittis, if anybody speaks Hebrew, that God gave to Moses that said, no, you ain't, guess what? You ain't going into the promised land because you did your job and you ain't gonna like it there.
Right, oh, wow. Well, I wanted to let the audience, anybody listening, know if they wanted to chat in a question. We can work in a couple. We still have a little time. Last thing I wanted to kind of ask you is a little bit about the theater. And obviously it's taking quite a beating in the lockdown here, as are pretty much all the performing arts, anything that takes place in a theater, let alone sporting events and you know, travel. But where can the theater go, assuming that, let's say, we get a vaccine or what, you know, people are able to go? What do you feel like you know, you may be, I don't know, what are your thoughts on the theater and the future of the theater? I'm thinking of some of your early ones where you talked about it as this cleansing act, this beautiful ritual. Do you still feel that way about it?
Yeah, but the difference between a theater and film basically is in the theater you can't eat popcorn. And that's good because I love popcorn, but the popcorn, it gets caught in your teeth. So, you know, if you're doing Eugene O'Neill, you really have to stay awake, you know, and and concentrate because nothing's happening. And you have this fucking thing caught in your tooth. It's very, very difficult. So that's why I prefer the theater. But there's a couple of things I just did online. One of them is for a benefit to the Actors Fund. Jeffrey Richards, who produced my play November on Broadway, produced it for in a whatever the hell this is called, streaming format. I think you can find it tomorrow. November Actors Fund's got John Malkovich and Patti LuPone, Dylan Baker. Another thing I did for the Berkshire Theater Festival online was a short play of mine called Dorothy Kilgallen, brand new play. It's a monologue that Rebecca Pidgeon does. And you could probably find that Dorothy Kilgallen, Rebecca Pidgeon, Berkshire Theater Festival. So we're going to do more of this. The theater will come back eventually. It's a virus, right? Big deal. We've had them before. We'll have them again. We'll figure out how to deal with it. We have figured out how to deal with it.
And I wanted to just ask about this, maybe, again, some of the audience doesn't know, but you decided to stop allowing theaters to have post-show discussions of the play in the theater after your plays, you know, or you would either fine them or revoke the license to the shows. Don't you want people to talk about your work after they see it? Don't you want them to have a place to digest it and discuss its meaning?
Well, you told me the other day, Daniel, that you had the, I'm so glad you had the opportunity to come see a new play of mine we just did just before the plague called The Christopher Boys Communion, right? Billy Macy and Dominic Hoffman and Dave Payman, Rebecca, a lot of people in it, Fionnuala Flanagan. And you said that after the play, you and a friend of yours took a long walk around the block and talked about the play, right? And then you asked me, why did I not want the people to talk about the play in the theater? And my response was, because if I did, you guys wouldn't have taken that walk. Mm-hmm. Of course I want people to talk about the play, but I don't want them to get into a discussion with the actors because, as Aristotle told us, that's violating the aesthetic distance.
Oh, I see.
There's nothing.
It has to do with forcing the actors to come out. I didn't realize that and explain their
or the director. It doesn't make any difference. I mean, it's not a goddamn English class for, you know. If I wanted to become an English teacher, you know, I'd be driving a 55-year-old Volvo now, you know, and no doubt enjoying it.
Got it. Yeah. Well, one critic said about you, or not a critic, but somebody writing about your work, and I think this is a great compliment, said that Mamet celebrates above all the audience's capacity for critical judgment, meaning that you never tell the audience what to think. You never. Well,
they're very smart. That's one of the things about one finds out from, because you really want to learn how to write dramatic stuff. You got to watch the audience. And Billy Wilder, the great Billy Wilder, said, individually, they're idiots. Collectively, they're a genius, right. Which is true. I've never met a dumb audience. But to take Wilder's apperçu and turn it around about our people, the Jews, I think the opposite is true, right? Individually, we're probably pretty effing smart, but collectively, we're awful goddamn stupid. I will exempt the Orthodox and our brothers and sisters in the Jewish state of Israel and no one else.
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna run some questions by you. You can go into detail or be brief as you feel. Somebody is.
Wait, you think I can be brief?
There are times an aphorism or an axiom that really sums it up. And if not, that's interesting too. The longer one. So it just says, "Hey, David, could you talk a little bit more about the Dreyfus affair?" I guess not everybody knows the history of it, but what does it mean to you, and I guess, and the significance of it?
Well, Dreyfus was a wealthy French Jew, and he was very committed to France, and he was a captain in, I believe, the artillery, which was very, very unusual to have a Jewish officer in the army. And some plans went missing. I think it was 1893, 1895. And people said, oh, the plans for the fortifications against the Germans have gone missing. Ah, the Dreyfus family came from Germany. Obviously, he's a Jew. He must be guilty. So they tried him, and the evidence was obviously phonied up. And they found him guilty on no evidence whatever. And they sent him to Devil's Island for life. And the world was, some of the world was enraged, including Clemenceau, and very particularly Émile Zola, who wrote something called J'accuse, who accused the whole French nation, and he had to leave France. Yeah. So the nation was polarized. Eventually, it came out that the evidence had been phonied, completely phonied up, and that everybody in the army knew it, but that they said in the highest levels of the army, the enclaves of the, also of the old nobility, the army had to be protected at all costs, so that he had to be a traitor. He had a second trial at which he was found guilty again, but then, quote, pardoned. And eventually he was reinstated and given the Legion of Honor. But for 10 years, that's all anybody talked, just like Trump today, that's all anybody talked about in France. Was he guilty? Was he not guilty? And so this guy Drummond, you should go back and have everybody look at the stuff that was written about Dreyfus. One writer said, if he's not guilty, it's even better because the Jews need to suffer.
Well, in some ways, I think it actually contributed to the Zionist movement realizing, hey, we need a state. You know, if Dreyfus, I think it was, you know, in the collective consciousness, actually.
Well, it was more than the collective consciousness. Theodor Herzl was an Austrian assimilated Jew.
Right.
And he was writing for an Austrian paper covering the Dreyfus trial. And when Dreyfus was stripped of all of his uniforms, everyone was screaming, "Kill the Jew." And Theodor Herzl was shot, just like Jabotinsky, in effect. He was shot, and Moses, he was shocked into Jewishness, saying, wait a second, they aren't saying kill the traitor, they're saying kill the Jew. So the modern Zionist movement was started because Theodor Herzl went to the Dreyfus trial.
Right. So I have a few more, but I didn't want to forget to ask you before the top of the hour about your involvement with JNF. Do you want to say a few words about what brought you into the JNF family to, you know, get involved and you know, make a big pledge and just to be part of things? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, I was on a trip with another family in Israel years ago, and they had a son who was autistic, you know, brilliant kid. At that point, they believe they called it Asperger's syndrome. I don't think they call it that anymore. They call it high functioning autism. And in any case, we were over at La Tron at the Armor Museum, and the kid was probably 12 years old. He was climbing all over the tanks, happy as a clam, as who wouldn't be. And one of the sergeants there who was running the museum said to him, why don't you come back sometime, you know, learn to drive a tank, you know, fight for the state. And this kid got this wonderful, impossible, God, would I love to look. And I thought a lot about that. And at some point I heard about a program of JNF called Special in Uniform, which was started by, which was started to take young people who otherwise couldn't serve in the IDF because of some disability. And rather than concentrating on that disability, concentrate on their ability and say, well, wait a second. Even if you can't, like the woman I met who was at that time was an operative major in full service major in intelligence, was one of the heads. She had cerebral palsy. She could hardly walk, but they figured, wait a second, you've got to walk. You don't have to walk to be in intelligence, right? That they were, you could use autistic kids for photo surveillance because you can't trick them with their eyes, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought back in that this is a great tradition, and especially in the United States in World War II, we had people working around. I live in Santa Monica at the Douglas plant here. Some portions of the aircraft were fabric covered, and they employed the blind because their fingers were more sensitive to the fine stitching that had to be used. So I got talking to these people about Special in Uniform, and I was so impressed with the idea of let's figure out what someone really can do. Let's not deprive these young people of the opportunity to fulfill themselves through service to the state.
And that's great, because the state's founding, it was so predicated on everyone contributing and everyone being a part. And this way people aren't marginalized even further by not getting to contribute, by finding ways for them. As you say, there may be jobs where they're even more qualified than other people. So.
Yeah, and listen, also Yossi Kahana from Jnf said that now that there are certain aspects of the American military that are reaching out to see if American kids could participate in a similar program, either there as part of the IDF or in the American military. I think it's terrific.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, let me get back to a few other audience questions. I think we're still holding a lot of our participants here. So can we separate the writer from the writing? We may love Woody Allen, but hate his personal pervy choices. Can we love his movies while hating his personal conduct?
Well, who am I to tell you what to love or what not to love?
Well, the principle,
right?
Principle of somebody who maybe, you know.
I mean, Brahms was an necrophiliac, right? He used to have sex with dead people, right? We can still love Brahms' Lullaby. I made that up, but I mean, it could be true.
I do love Brahms, but I need to think about that now.
Of course, it's none of our business. You know, it's none of our goddamn business.
Okay.
That's not to say that we are not free to disapprove of
Right.
things which come to our attention.
Right.
But I mean, do we live in San Francisco, for Christ's sake? We got to say if a guy actually ate a sandwich with gluten in it, we can never listen to his songs.
Okay. You have talked about how Jews have been kicked out of every country they resided in the last 2,000 years. When do you think the US will become inhospitable for Jews? And do you think the xenophobia, which tens of millions of Americans have recently shown enthusiasm for, is a foreshadowing of intolerance which will eventually be turned against Jews?
Well, I don't know what xenophobia that the person's talking about. I think what they mean, what I understand by people using throwing around the term xenophobia, is having a border. But as you will notice, the European Union, which is always a dreadful, dreadful idea, and that goes back to the Torah too, where it says the thieves say, I know what we'll do. We'll take all of our money and we'll throw it into one pot. And whoever needs the money from the thieving pot will take it out. And then when people steal more, they'll throw it in. So the European Union, boom, you got a plague hits them. And all of a sudden, on Thursday, all of a sudden on Sunday, they say, wait a second, we need borders, right? It's not xenophobia, right? It's called having a country. What a country provides is rules. You may like them or you may not hate them, but in a good country, they're clear. And if you don't have any rules, A, and P, you have people coming in to whom you say, we're going to give you a pass. The citizens have to behave in a certain way, but because we love you, because we love all humanity, you don't have to behave in that way. You don't have a country anymore. And so if you look at the history of Persia, you know, they took in the Mamelukes and they said, you know, you do the odd jobs, you sweep you sweep up the garbage and blah, blah, blah. You don't have to become a Persian. And, you know, 500 years later, they took over the country. Of course they did.
You don't see that getting turned against the Jews. The second part of the question being like, you know, are there ill winds at all right now? Or you don't think?
Well, of course there are. I mean, if you look at the squad in whatever the names are, those harpies in Congress making anti-Semitic remarks, nobody says boo, right? People come to me over the years and they say, you know what we need? We need more movies showing that Jews are good. It's like Outreach, right? Which is a whole bunch of please don't hit me. It's a bunch of nonsense. We don't need more movies like that. We need more people standing up in Congress and more people standing up in the Senate and more people standing outside the door with a legally licensed firearm saying, guess what? I'm no different. It's like we need Stonewall, right? Anybody remember what Stonewall was? It was like 1972. It was a famous gay bar in Sheridan Square, and the cops came in to rough them up, and the people rioted, and they said, that's it. You can't beat us up anymore. So Israel is our Stonewall, and we need to take a lesson from that over here.
I forgot to ask you about one of your Jewish books, and someone's writing in asking me to ask you, called Passover.
Oh yeah.
You know, that's
a kid's book. I can't, and Michael McCurdy did the drawings for it. And it's a stories, it's based on the stories my grandmother used to tell me, who came from Russian Poland, about the pogroms and hiding people under their skirts and taking the chicken and the stuff that used to happen to her. It's pretty close. You know, she came over here in 1922. They would take the chicken and they'd rip the chicken open and they'd spatter its blood all around the walls. Then they'd break out all the own windows, rip up the pillows and throw the things out. So when the Poles came through, always happened at Passover, because the Catholic Church preached destruction of the Jews, especially on Passover, that perhaps they'd let this Jewish house alone. Yeah, it's a long time ago.
Do you still cook any of those recipes, or do you know? Are you much of a cook even during the lockdown here of some of these?
Well, my wife is a great cook, but I came up with a great, I do a lot of cartoons. One of them was, it was Hadassah of Pasadena, the Rose Bowl cook-off for Passover, right? The Tournament of Harosis.
The Tournament of the Roses, Haroses, yes. So
exactly. So my wife is a great cook of everything, and she cooks great Jewish food and great haroses, great lot, everything. But she won't make cholent, which is a shame because I love cholent. It's like Jewish cocaine.
Yes, yes. Lucky you about the rest of it, though. Somebody's asking, what's your favorite of your own movies that you wrote or directed? It's hard to, yeah. Do you have one of your own?
See, that's the problem. No, but that's, thank you for asking. That's the problem with asking these questions, because of any artists, the answer finally is, I'll be goddamned if I know, right? Because if you actually know, you start from a perfect idea and you're going to, which has a perfect theme, and you're going to explore it perfectly, you're a hack. Right? Anybody can do that, which is the whole idea of the Iowa Writers School.
Yeah. And so what about anything you've enjoyed, like somebody's writing that, well, he says he doesn't watch a lot of TV, but what about a couple good movie recommendations, since we're all watching Prime and Netflix? Anything come to mind in the last 6 months or a year?
Yeah, sure. So my wife and I watch old movies every day, and we discovered, or she discovered on YouTube, there's every movie ever made. And some of them are, stolen off TV and kinescopes, and some of them are perfect. But I love old, forgotten movies from the 30s. In fact, I just saw one yesterday called Bengal Tiger, about Barton McLean, a tiger trainer, and June Travis, his love. And then I saw a great movie called Maniac, 1963, about a guy who burns people to death with a blowtorch. And it has my favorite line where the guy says to the girl, "Let's face it, Eve, we're dealing with a homicidal maniac." I love it. You just can't beat good writing.
Yes, and facing the truth. So anything that we don't know about that is coming out, another film in the can, is other than the novel, any of work?
Yeah, I wrote a book that I hope will be coming out maybe in 6 months or so. It's a fictionalized reminiscence of life in a New England boarding school. It's called 40 Years at Anstead. I had fun writing that.
Okay, I'm going to look that up.
I have fun writing most everything except the other half of the time when I want to kill myself.
Somebody's asking, you seem to stream active creative responses to your inner critic. How would you advise younger artists looking ahead to where they want to be at age 72 to do the same? I'm not sure if that makes sense. Do you get it?
Well, Anthony Trollope, I love Anthony Trollope, right? He was a great late Victorian novelist, wrote 47 novels, they're all terrific. And in his autobiography, which is kind of swell, he says, well, here's what I advise young writers, is get yourself some cobbler's wax and put it on your seat. If I may translate, you got to sit in a room and sit there and take your stupid machines and lock them in the other room and sit there until you go nuts. Yeah. Because if you don't, you'll never write anything good.
Well, that has not been your issue. We are so grateful for all the good things you've written, David, and look forward to more. Even if you're starting to see yourself as Moses not getting into the promised land, we hope you have a few more great things in your knuckles there, I trust.
Well, thanks. Also, if there's anybody out there who I haven't affronted or offended, I did my best.
No, today we got the mishpacha, David. We didn't get both claws. We only got one. I'm very pleased and grateful. I want to just thank you, David. Thank from the JNF, Sharon Joy, Vivian Diamond Grossman, Sivia Caroline, Amy Fass, Sarah Cohen, Jody Bodner, Yossi Kahana. If you guys, anybody wants to get involved in the Arts and Entertainment Task Force, we hope to do more programs like this. Reach out to Sivia or to Sharon Joy. And David, we hope to keep you in the family, and we're all super proud of your work. And
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hello to all the Shalom Chaverim, and thank you guys for supporting the JNF, and thank you to the JNF for supporting the rest of us.